In August of 2018, 24-year-old photography student Jessica Palmer set out on what was supposed to be a 3-day solo camping trip in Yosemite National Park, California. She had planned to photograph the sunrise from Glacier Point and explore several lesser-known trails for her senior thesis project at San Francisco State University. Jessica told her roommate that she would return by Tuesday evening, but when Wednesday morning came and her bed remained empty, her roommate knew something was wrong. The same afternoon, Jessica's parents received a call that would change their lives forever. Their daughter had vanished without a trace in one of America's most visited national parks. 7 months of searching yielded nothing but questions and false leads. Then, in March of 2019, a park maintenance worker trimming branches near the Mist Trail made a discovery that would crack the case wide open. Hanging from a high branch, weathered by months of rain and snow, was a piece of red fabric that would prove to be the first real clue in Jessica Palmer's disappearance. The morning of August 14, 2018, dawned clear and cool in Yosemite Valley. According to the weather station at Curry Village, the temperature at sunrise was 52 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect conditions for hiking and photography. At approximately 6:30 in the morning, Jessica Palmer's silver Honda Civic was recorded entering the park through the south entrance. The entrance booth attendant later recalled during questioning that the young woman seemed excited and well-prepared, carrying professional camera equipment and a large hiking backpack. She purchased a 3-day camping permit for the backpackers' campground and mentioned to the attendant that she was working on a college photography project. The attendant noted that Jessica appeared confident and familiar with park procedures, suggesting this was not her first visit to Yosemite. Jessica's planned itinerary, which she had shared with her roommate via text message the night before, included camping at the backpackers' campground for 2 nights and hiking to several photographic locations during the day. Her primary destinations were Glacier Point for sunrise photography, the Mist Trail for waterfall shots, and a lesser-known area called Tenaya Creek for what she described as hidden gem photographs. According to her photography professor, who was later interviewed by investigators, Jessica was an experienced hiker and photographer who had completed similar solo trips in other national parks. She was known for her careful planning and attention to safety protocols. The last confirmed sighting of Jessica alive occurred at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon on August 15, her second day in the park. A family from Oregon, the Hendersons, encountered her on the Mist Trail near Vernal Fall. During subsequent interviews, they described Jessica as friendly and enthusiastic, stopping to help them identify a bird species they had photographed. Mrs. Henderson specifically remembered Jessica's red hiking shirt and professional camera equipment. The family noted that Jessica was hiking alone but seemed comfortable and confident on the trail. She mentioned to them that she was heading toward a secret spot she had discovered on a previous visit, though she did not specify the exact location. This conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it would prove to be crucial in establishing the timeline of Jessica's disappearance. That evening, Jessica failed to return to the backpackers' campground. Her tent remained set up, and her sleeping bag and personal belongings were undisturbed. The campground host, an experienced volunteer named Robert Mills, noticed her absence during his evening rounds but initially assumed she had decided to camp elsewhere or had left the park early. It was not uncommon for backpackers to change their plans without notifying the campground office. However, when Jessica's tent remained untouched for a second night, Mills became concerned and reported the situation to park rangers on the morning of August 17. The initial response was swift but routine. Park rangers checked Jessica's vehicle, which remained parked in the day-use area near the Mist Trail trailhead. The car was locked and there were no signs of disturbance. Inside, rangers found Jessica's purse containing her identification, credit cards, and a small amount of cash. Her car keys were missing, suggesting she had taken them with her on the trail. A preliminary search of the immediate area around the trailhead revealed no obvious clues. Rangers noted that Jessica's camera equipment case was also missing from the vehicle, confirming that she had indeed set out with her photography gear as planned. By the afternoon of August 17, Jessica's roommate, Amanda Foster, had contacted Jessica's parents in Sacramento after being unable to reach her by phone for 2 days. Jessica's mother, Linda Palmer, immediately drove to Yosemite and met with park rangers to file an official missing person report. During the interview, Linda provided crucial information about her daughter's hiking experience and typical behavior. Jessica was an experienced outdoors enthusiast who had been hiking since childhood. She always carried emergency supplies including a whistle, first aid kit, and emergency shelter. Most importantly, Jessica was known for her punctuality and reliable communication. She had never failed to check in with family or friends as promised. The formal search operation began at dawn on August 18, 4 days after Jessica was last seen. The search team included Yosemite National Park rangers, volunteers from the Yosemite Search and Rescue Team, and specialized K-9 units trained in wilderness tracking. The operation was coordinated by Chief Ranger David Thompson, a veteran with over 20 years of experience in wilderness search and rescue. The initial search focused on the Mist Trail and surrounding areas, based on the last confirmed sighting by the Henderson family. The search dogs picked up Jessica's scent along the main Mist Trail but lost it near a junction where several unofficial trails branched off into more remote areas of the park. These unofficial trails, known locally as social trails, were created by hikers over the years and were not maintained or marked by the Park Service. Some led to scenic viewpoints popular with photographers, while others simply petered out in dense forest or rocky terrain. The fact that Jessica's scent disappeared at this junction suggested she had left the main trail, but determining which direction she had taken proved impossible. Over the following week, the search expanded to cover nearly 50 square miles of wilderness. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras scanned the forest canopy and rocky areas where an injured hiker might seek shelter. Ground teams methodically combed through dense undergrowth, steep ravines, and boulder fields where someone could easily become trapped or injured. The search included areas that were technically beyond the range of a day hike, accounting for the possibility that Jessica had become lost and wandered far from her intended route. Despite the intensive effort, the search yielded no trace of Jessica Palmer. No clothing, no camera equipment, no emergency supplies, and no signs of a campsite or shelter. The complete absence of any physical evidence was particularly puzzling to experienced searchers. In most cases involving lost hikers, search teams find at least some indication of the person's route or final location. Dropped items, footprints, broken vegetation, or emergency signals typically provide clues about what happened. In Jessica's case, it was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. After 2 weeks of searching, the active phase of the operation was officially suspended. The case remained open and park rangers continued to investigate any reported sightings or new information. Jessica's parents established a reward fund and distributed flyers throughout California, hoping that someone might have seen their daughter or have information about her disappearance. Local media covered the story extensively, and Jessica's photograph was shared thousands of times on social media. Despite the widespread attention, no credible leads emerged. The months that followed were agonizing for Jessica's family and friends. Her parents made regular trips to Yosemite, hiking the trails where she was last seen and speaking with anyone who might have encountered her. They organized volunteer search efforts and worked with private investigators to explore every possible lead. Jessica's roommate Amanda struggled with guilt, wondering if she should have been more concerned when Jessica first failed to return as planned. The photography professor who had encouraged Jessica's thesis project questioned whether he should have discouraged her from hiking alone in such remote areas. As winter approached, hope began to fade. Snow covered the high country where Jessica might have traveled, making further searching impossible until spring. The harsh reality began to set in that Jessica Palmer might never be found. Yosemite's vast wilderness had claimed other visitors over the years, and some had never been recovered despite extensive search efforts. The park's rugged terrain, with its deep canyons, swift rivers, and dense forests, could easily conceal evidence for years or even decades. Winter in Yosemite brought heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures that transformed the landscape where Jessica had disappeared. The trails she had hiked became impassable, buried under several feet of snow. Any evidence that might have survived the initial search was now frozen and hidden until the spring thaw. For Jessica's family, the winter months were a time of painful waiting and diminishing hope. They continued to receive occasional reports of possible sightings, but each lead proved to be a case of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. As spring arrived in 2019, the snow began to melt in Yosemite's high country, revealing the landscape that had been hidden for months. Park maintenance crews began their annual work of clearing trails, repairing winter damage, and preparing popular hiking routes for the upcoming tourist season. It was during this routine maintenance work that the first real breakthrough in Jessica Palmer's case would finally emerge. On March 22, 2019, exactly 7 months and 8 days after Jessica was last seen alive, maintenance worker Carlos Rivera was trimming overgrown branches along a section of the mist trail when he noticed something unusual hanging from a pine tree approximately 15 feet above the ground. Rivera, who had worked for the National Park Service for 12 years, initially thought the red fabric was a piece of trash that had been blown into the tree by winter winds. Littering was an ongoing problem in the park, and maintenance crews regularly removed items that visitors had carelessly discarded or lost. However, as Rivera positioned his ladder to retrieve the fabric, he realized that what he was looking at was not random trash. The red material appeared to be a piece of women's underwear, and it was hanging from the branch in a way that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. The fabric was weathered and faded from months of exposure to rain, snow, and sun, but it was still clearly recognizable as an intimate garment. Rivera immediately stopped his work and contacted his supervisor, who in turn notified park rangers. Within an hour, the area around the tree had been cordoned off as a potential crime scene. Chief Ranger David Thompson, who had coordinated the original search for Jessica Palmer, arrived at the scene along with 2 other rangers and a photographer to document the discovery. The red underwear was carefully removed from the branch using specialized equipment to preserve any potential evidence. Even before laboratory analysis could confirm it, Thompson suspected that this discovery was connected to the missing photography student. The underwear was immediately transported to the California Department of Justice Crime Laboratory in Sacramento for analysis. The fabric was tested for DNA evidence, and investigators also examined it for any other trace materials that might provide clues about what had happened to Jessica. While waiting for the laboratory results, park rangers began a new search of the area surrounding the tree where the underwear had been found. This location was approximately 2 miles from where Jessica had last been seen by the Henderson family, in a section of forest that had been searched during the original operation but had yielded no evidence at the time. The DNA analysis confirmed what investigators had suspected. The underwear belonged to Jessica Palmer, matching samples provided by her family during the original investigation. This discovery marked the first concrete evidence that Jessica had been in this specific area of the park, and it raised disturbing questions about how her underwear had ended up hanging from a tree branch so far above the ground. The height and position of the fabric suggested that it had been placed there intentionally, rather than being caught by the wind or dropped accidentally during a fall. News of the discovery spread quickly through the law enforcement community and eventually reached Jessica's family. For Linda and Robert Palmer, the confirmation that the underwear belonged to their daughter brought a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. After 7 months of uncertainty, they finally had proof that Jessica had been in a specific location, but the circumstances of the discovery suggested that something terrible had happened to her. The fact that her underwear had been found hanging from a tree in such a deliberate manner indicated that Jessica had likely encountered someone with malicious intent. The discovery prompted a renewed investigation into Jessica's disappearance, now officially reclassified as a suspected homicide. Detective Lisa Morgan from the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office was assigned to lead the criminal investigation, working in cooperation with National Park Service rangers and federal investigators. Morgan, a 15-year veteran with extensive experience in violent crimes, immediately recognized the significance of the underwear's placement. In her professional opinion, the deliberate positioning of the garment suggested that the perpetrator wanted it to be found, possibly as a trophy or a message. The investigation team began by re-examining all the evidence from the original search, looking for details that might have been overlooked when Jessica's disappearance was considered a missing person case rather than a potential homicide. They reviewed witness statements, analyzed Jessica's planned itinerary, and studied maps of the area where she had been hiking. The team also began compiling a list of everyone who had been in Yosemite during the time period when Jessica disappeared, focusing particularly on individuals who had camping permits or were known to frequent the park. One aspect of the investigation that received particular attention was the location where the underwear had been found. The tree was situated along a lesser-used section of trail that connected the main mist trail to several unofficial paths leading deeper into the wilderness. This area was known to experienced hikers and photographers as a route to secluded viewpoints and hidden waterfalls. The fact that Jessica's underwear was found here suggested that she had indeed left the main trail, possibly following someone who claimed to know about photographic opportunities in the area. Detective Morgan interviewed the Henderson family again, asking them to recall every detail of their encounter with Jessica on the day she disappeared. During this second interview, Mrs. Henderson remembered an additional detail that had not seemed important at the time. She recalled that while they were talking with Jessica, they had noticed another hiker in the distance, a man who appeared to be watching their conversation. Mrs. Henderson described him as middle-aged, wearing dark clothing and carrying a large backpack. At the time, she had not thought much of it, assuming he was simply another hiker taking a break on the trail. This new information led investigators to focus on identifying other hikers who had been in the area during Jessica's visit. They reviewed trail registers, camping permits, and entrance records, looking for anyone who matched the description provided by Mrs. Henderson. The investigation team also reached out to other visitors who had been in Yosemite during that time period, asking them to review their photographs and videos for any images that might show Jessica or the mysterious man who had been observed watching her. The search for additional evidence expanded beyond the immediate area where the underwear had been found. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, investigators systematically examined locations within a 5-mile radius of the discovery site. They paid particular attention to areas where a body might have been concealed, including dense undergrowth, rocky crevices, and abandoned mining sites that dotted the region from Yosemite's gold rush era. The terrain was challenging, with steep slopes, thick vegetation, and numerous hiding places where evidence could remain hidden for years. During this expanded search, investigators made another significant discovery. Approximately 1 mile from where the underwear had been found, searchers located Jessica's camera equipment partially buried under a pile of rocks and debris. The professional camera body and telephoto lens that Jessica had been carrying were damaged beyond repair, apparently smashed with a heavy object before being hidden. The memory cards from the camera were missing, suggesting that the perpetrator had taken them, possibly because they contained images that could identify him. The discovery of Jessica's destroyed camera equipment provided additional confirmation that she had been the victim of a violent crime. The deliberate destruction of the expensive equipment indicated that the perpetrator was not motivated by theft, since the camera gear could have been sold for a substantial amount of money. Instead, the destruction suggested that the perpetrator was primarily concerned with eliminating evidence, particularly any photographs that Jessica might have taken of him. Forensic analysis of the camera equipment revealed several important clues. Despite the damage, technicians were able to recover partial fingerprints from the camera body and lens. These prints did not match Jessica's fingerprints or those of any known criminals in the database, but they provided a potential means of identifying the perpetrator if he was ever apprehended. Additionally, microscopic analysis of the damage patterns on the camera revealed that it had been struck repeatedly with a rock or similar heavy object, indicating a level of violence that suggested the perpetrator was in an extreme emotional state. The investigation team also examined the location where the camera equipment had been hidden. The site was in a remote area off any established trail, accessible only to someone with extensive knowledge of the local terrain. This suggested that the perpetrator was familiar with Yosemite and had likely visited the park multiple times. The careful concealment of the equipment also indicated that the perpetrator had taken time to plan his actions, rather than acting purely on impulse. As the investigation progressed, Detective Morgan began developing a profile of the likely perpetrator. Based on the evidence and the circumstances of the crime, she believed they were looking for a man who was familiar with Yosemite's trail system, possibly a frequent visitor or someone who worked in the area. The perpetrator was likely someone who appeared trustworthy enough to convince Jessica to leave the main trail, possibly by claiming to know about photographic opportunities in remote areas. The deliberate placement of Jessica's underwear and the destruction of her camera equipment suggested someone who was organized and methodical, but also someone who wanted to send a message or assert dominance over his victim. The investigation team began focusing on individuals who fit this profile, including park employees, frequent visitors, and local residents who were known to spend time in Yosemite. They also examined similar crimes in other national parks, looking for patterns that might indicate a serial offender. The methodical nature of the crime and the perpetrator's apparent familiarity with the terrain suggested that this might not have been his first offense. The investigation into Jessica Palmer's disappearance took a significant turn when Detective Morgan decided to expand the search beyond Yosemite's boundaries. She contacted law enforcement agencies throughout California and neighboring states, requesting information about similar crimes involving young women who had disappeared while hiking alone. The methodical nature of Jessica's case, combined with the perpetrator's apparent knowledge of wilderness areas, suggested that this might be part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior. Within 2 weeks of sending out these inquiries, Morgan received a response that would prove crucial to the investigation. Detective Frank Russo from the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office contacted Morgan about a case that bore striking similarities to Jessica's disappearance. In September 2017, nearly a year before Jessica vanished, a 26-year-old nature photographer named Kelly Brooks had disappeared while hiking alone in the Redwood National and State Parks. Like Jessica, Kelly was an experienced hiker who had been working on a photography project. She had last been seen talking to an unidentified man on a remote trail, and her camera equipment was later found destroyed and hidden in the forest. Most significantly, a piece of Kelly's clothing had been found hanging from a tree branch several months after her disappearance, in a manner nearly identical to how Jessica's underwear had been discovered. The similarities between the two cases were too numerous to be coincidental. Both victims were young women in their 20s, both were photographers working alone in remote areas, both had been seen talking to an unknown man before disappearing, and both had their camera equipment destroyed and personal items displayed in trees. Detective Morgan immediately traveled to Humboldt County to review the Kelly Brooks case file and coordinate with local investigators. The collaboration between the two agencies would prove to be the breakthrough the investigation needed. Detective Russo shared his case files with Morgan, including witness descriptions of the man who had been seen talking to Kelly Brooks before her disappearance. The description provided by witnesses in the Redwood case was remarkably similar to the one given by Mrs. Henderson in Jessica's case. Both described a middle-aged white male, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair and a beard. He was described as wearing outdoor clothing and carrying a large backpack, appearing to be an experienced hiker. Most importantly, witnesses in both cases noted that the man seemed to be specifically targeting young women who were hiking alone. The joint investigation team began looking for connections between the two locations where the crimes had occurred. Yosemite and the Redwood parks were approximately 300 miles apart, but both were popular destinations for outdoor enthusiasts and photographers. The team theorized that the perpetrator might be someone who traveled frequently between different wilderness areas, possibly for work or as part of an outdoor lifestyle. They began examining employment records for companies that operated in both regions, including tour guide services, outdoor equipment retailers, and seasonal workers who moved between different parks. One name that emerged from this analysis was Thomas Brennan, a 42-year-old freelance wilderness guide who had worked in both Yosemite and the Redwood region during the time periods when the crimes occurred. Brennan had been employed by several different outdoor adventure companies over the years, leading hiking and photography tours for clients who wanted to access remote areas of various national parks. His work history showed that he had been in Yosemite during August 2018 and in the Redwood area during September 2017, placing him in both locations at the times when Jessica and Kelly had disappeared. Background checks on Brennan revealed a troubling pattern of behavior. While he had no serious criminal convictions, he had been the subject of several complaints from female clients over the years. Multiple women had reported feeling uncomfortable during tours with Brennan, describing him as overly interested in their personal lives and inappropriately persistent in trying to extend their time together. 2 women had filed formal complaints with tour companies, alleging that Brennan had made unwanted advances and had become aggressive when rejected. In both cases, Brennan had been quietly dismissed from his employment, but no criminal charges had been filed. Detective Morgan obtained a warrant to search Brennan's residence, a small cabin he rented in the Sierra Nevada foothills between Yosemite and Lake Tahoe. The location was strategically positioned to provide easy access to multiple wilderness areas, supporting the theory that Brennan used his knowledge of these regions to target victims. The search of his property would yield evidence that definitively linked him to both crimes and revealed the full extent of his predatory behavior. The search team discovered a disturbing collection of photographs and personal items in Brennan's cabin. Hidden in a locked storage room, investigators found hundreds of photographs of young women hiking alone in various wilderness areas. Many of the photos appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge, using telephoto lenses from concealed positions. Among these photographs were several images of both Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks, taken on the days they disappeared. The photos showed both women hiking alone, unaware that they were being stalked and photographed by their future killer. Even more damning was the discovery of personal items belonging to both victims. In addition to the memory cards from Jessica's camera, which contained the photos she had taken on her final day, investigators found Kelly Brooks' driver's license, several pieces of jewelry, and a small notebook she had been using to record observations for her photography project. These items had been carefully preserved and organized, suggesting that Brennan kept them as trophies of his crimes. The methodical way in which the items were stored indicated that this was not impulsive behavior, but rather a calculated pattern of predatory activity. The search also revealed evidence of Brennan's planning and preparation for his crimes. Investigators found detailed maps of various national parks with specific trails and remote areas marked in red ink. Many of these locations were noted as places where subjects frequently hike alone, or good isolation for photography. The maps showed that Brennan had been systematically identifying locations where he could encounter and isolate potential victims. His knowledge of these areas, gained through years of working as a wilderness guide, had given him the perfect cover for his predatory activities. Computer analysis revealed that Brennan had been researching his victims online before encountering them in person. His internet search history showed that he had looked up Jessica Palmer's photography website and social media profiles several days before her disappearance. He had also researched Kelly Brooks' work and had apparently identified her planned visit to the Redwood area through her online posts about her photography project. This evidence demonstrated that Brennan's encounters with his victims were not random, but were the result of careful planning and stalking. The investigation team also discovered evidence that Brennan had been escalating his criminal behavior over time. In addition to the two murders, they found evidence linking him to several other incidents involving young women in wilderness areas. Multiple women had reported being followed or approached by a man matching Brennan's description in various national parks over the past several years. In some cases, women had managed to escape or had been rescued by other hikers before anything serious occurred. The pattern suggested that Brennan had been perfecting his methods over time, learning from each encounter to become more effective at isolating and controlling his victims. Forensic analysis of items found in Brennan's cabin provided additional evidence linking him to the crimes. DNA evidence on personal items belonging to both victims matched samples taken from Brennan after his arrest. Fingerprints found on Jessica's destroyed camera equipment matched prints taken from items in Brennan's possession. Most significantly, fibers from clothing found in his cabin matched fibers discovered at both crime scenes, providing physical evidence that placed him at the locations where the murders occurred. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered Brennan's detailed journal, hidden behind a false wall in his cabin. The journal contained disturbing entries describing his encounters with various women over several years, including detailed accounts of the murders of Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks. In his own words, Brennan described how he had approached each victim, gained their trust by claiming to know about exceptional photography locations, and then led them to remote areas where he could attack them without being discovered. The journal entries revealed the full extent of Brennan's predatory mindset. He wrote about the thrill he experienced from stalking young women and the sense of power he felt when he was able to control their fate. He described his victims in dehumanizing terms, referring to them as subjects and targets rather than as people. The entries showed that Brennan viewed his crimes not as acts of violence against innocent people, but as a form of hunting that satisfied his need for dominance and control. If you're finding this investigation as compelling as we are, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates on this case or other true crime stories we cover. The evidence we're about to reveal gets even more disturbing. The journal also contained Brennan's plans for future crimes. He had identified several other young women through their online photography portfolios and social media accounts, and had begun researching their planned visits to various wilderness areas. The journal included detailed notes about their hiking preferences, the types of locations they photographed, and the times when they were most likely to be hiking alone. This evidence suggested that if Brennan had not been caught, he would have continued killing, potentially claiming many more victims. One of the most chilling aspects of the journal was Brennan's description of how he disposed of his victims' bodies. He wrote about using his knowledge of wilderness areas to find locations where bodies would never be discovered, including deep crevices, underground caves, and remote areas where natural processes would quickly eliminate any evidence. His entries suggested that Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks were not his only victims, but were simply the ones whose disappearances had been most thoroughly investigated. The journal entries also revealed Brennan's motivation for displaying his victims' personal items and trees. He wrote that he enjoyed the idea that these items would eventually be found, creating fear and uncertainty in the hiking community. He viewed the discovery of these items as a way of asserting his continued presence and power, even after the crimes had been committed. The placement of the items was his way of taunting law enforcement and the families of his victims, demonstrating that he could strike anywhere and leave behind only the evidence he chose to reveal. The arrest of Thomas Brennan took place on April 15, 2019, at his remote cabin in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Detective Morgan coordinated the operation with federal agents and local law enforcement, ensuring that Brennan would not have the opportunity to destroy additional evidence or flee to another wilderness area where he might evade capture. The arrest team approached the cabin at dawn, when Brennan was most likely to be inside and least likely to notice their presence until it was too late to escape. When agents knocked on his door, Brennan initially attempted to deny his identity, claiming to be a different person entirely. However, his fingerprints quickly confirmed his true identity, and he was taken into custody without physical resistance. During the initial interrogation, Brennan maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence found in his cabin. He claimed that the photographs of Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks were coincidental, taken during his legitimate work as a wilderness guide. He insisted that the personal items belonging to the victims had been planted in his cabin by someone trying to frame him. His explanations became increasingly contradictory as investigators presented him with specific evidence from his journal and the detailed accounts of his crimes written in his own handwriting. When confronted with direct quotes from his journal describing the murders, Brennan finally abandoned his denials and requested an attorney. The legal proceedings against Brennan began with his arraignment in federal court, since the crimes had occurred on federal land within national parks. The charges included 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. Federal prosecutors argued that Brennan's crimes represented a pattern of predatory behavior that posed a continuing threat to public safety in wilderness areas throughout the western United States. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Martinez, who specialized in violent crimes occurring on federal property and had extensive experience prosecuting cases involving serial offenders. The prosecution's case was built around 3 main pillars of evidence. First was the physical evidence linking Brennan to both crime scenes, including DNA, fingerprints, and fiber analysis that placed him at the locations where Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks had been murdered. Second was the collection of trophies and photographs found in his cabin, which demonstrated his systematic stalking and targeting of young women in wilderness areas. Third was Brennan's own journal, which provided a detailed confession to both murders and revealed his predatory mindset and future plans for additional crimes. Brennan's defense team, led by experienced criminal attorney Michael Davidson, faced the challenging task of defending a client against overwhelming evidence. Their strategy focused on questioning the admissibility of evidence obtained during the search of Brennan's cabin and arguing that his journal entries were fantasies rather than actual confessions. They claimed that Brennan was a troubled individual who had written fictional accounts of crimes he had not actually committed, and that the physical evidence had been contaminated or misinterpreted by investigators eager to solve high-profile cases. The trial began in September 2019, more than a year after Jessica Palmer's disappearance and nearly 2 years after Kelly Brooks had vanished in the redwood forests. The courtroom was packed with family members of both victims, law enforcement officers who had worked on the investigation, and members of the hiking and photography communities who had been shaken by the revelation that someone had been systematically targeting young women in areas they considered safe. Media coverage of the trial was extensive, with reporters from across the country covering what had become known as the wilderness predator case. The prosecution's presentation of evidence was methodical and devastating. Detective Morgan testified about the investigation process, walking the jury through the discovery of Jessica's underwear hanging from the tree branch and the subsequent evidence that led to Brennan's identification and arrest. Forensic experts explained the DNA and fingerprint evidence in detail, demonstrating conclusively that Brennan had been in contact with both victims and had handled their personal belongings after their deaths. The testimony was technical but compelling, leaving little doubt about Brennan's physical presence at both crime scenes. One of the most powerful moments in the trial came when prosecutors presented Brennan's journal to the jury. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez read selected passages aloud, including Brennan's detailed descriptions of how he had approached Jessica Palmer on the mist trail and convinced her to follow him to a remote location where he could attack her without being observed. The journal entries were written in Brennan's own handwriting and contained details about the crimes that only the perpetrator could have known. His descriptions of the victim's final moments were so detailed and accurate that they left no doubt about his guilt. The journal also revealed the calculated nature of Brennan's crimes. He had written about studying his victims' online profiles and social media accounts, learning their hiking preferences and photography interests so he could approach them with credible offers to show them exceptional locations for their work. He described how he had perfected his approach over time, learning to present himself as a knowledgeable and trustworthy guide who could help them access areas that were not available to ordinary tourists. His ability to gain his victims' trust was a crucial element of his predatory strategy. Brennan's journal entries also provided disturbing insights into his psychological state and motivations. He wrote about the sense of power and control he experienced when he was able to isolate his victims in remote locations where no one could hear their screams or come to their assistance. He described the wilderness areas as his hunting grounds, where he could act without fear of discovery or intervention. His entries revealed a complete lack of empathy for his victims, whom he viewed as objects to be collected and controlled rather than as human beings with their own lives and dreams. The prosecution also presented evidence of Brennan's escalating pattern of behavior over several years. Witnesses testified about encounters with Brennan in various wilderness areas, describing how he had approached them inappropriately or had made them feel uncomfortable during what were supposed to be professional guide services. Several women testified about incidents where Brennan had become aggressive when they rejected his advances or had tried to extend their time together beyond what they had agreed to. These testimonies established a pattern of predatory behavior that had culminated in murder when Brennan's victims were unable to escape his control. The defense team's attempts to challenge the evidence proved largely unsuccessful. Their arguments about evidence contamination were refuted by detailed testimony from forensic experts who explained the careful procedures used to collect and analyze the physical evidence. Their claims that Brennan's journal entries were fictional were undermined by the accuracy of details that matched the crime scenes and the victim's personal belongings. Most damaging to the defense was the discovery of additional evidence during the trial preparation, including photographs and personal items from other potential victims that had not been part of the original investigation. During the trial, investigators revealed that they had identified at least 3 other young women who had disappeared in wilderness areas where Brennan had been working as a guide. While they could not definitively prove that Brennan was responsible for these additional disappearances, the pattern was consistent with his known crimes and suggested that Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks were not his only victims. This evidence supported the prosecution's argument that Brennan represented a continuing threat to public safety and deserved the maximum possible sentence. The families of both victims provided victim impact statements that brought the human cost of Brennan's crimes into sharp focus. Jessica Palmer's mother, Linda, spoke about the devastating impact of losing her daughter and the additional trauma of learning the details of how she had died. She described Jessica as a vibrant young woman who had been passionate about photography and nature, and who had trusted in the basic goodness of people she met on the trails. Kelly Brooks' father spoke about his daughter's love of the outdoors and her dedication to her art, and how Brennan had stolen not only her life but also her family's ability to enjoy the wilderness areas where she had found so much joy. The trial also highlighted the broader implications of Brennan's crimes for the outdoor recreation community. Park rangers and wilderness safety experts testified about the impact of the murders on solo hikers, particularly young women who had previously felt safe exploring remote areas alone. Many testified that they had changed their hiking habits or had stopped hiking alone entirely after learning about the systematic nature of Brennan's predatory behavior. The crimes had created a climate of fear that extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the evidence against Brennan was overwhelming and that his conviction was virtually certain. The defense team's final strategy focused on trying to avoid the death penalty by arguing that Brennan suffered from mental illness that had impaired his judgment and ability to control his behavior. They presented testimony from psychiatrists who had examined Brennan and diagnosed him with various personality disorders and antisocial tendencies. However, the prosecution successfully argued that Brennan's careful planning and methodical approach to his crimes demonstrated that he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The speed of their deliberation reflected the strength of the evidence and the clarity of Brennan's guilt. When the verdicts were read, family members of both victims wept with relief, knowing that their daughter's killer would finally be held accountable for his crimes. The conviction represented not only justice for Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks, but also protection for countless other young women who might have become Brennan's victims if he had remained free. The sentencing phase of Thomas Brennan's trial began 3 weeks after his conviction, during which time additional evidence emerged that would influence the court's final decision. Federal prosecutors had continued their investigation into Brennan's activities, working with law enforcement agencies across multiple states to identify other potential victims and establish the full scope of his criminal enterprise. What they discovered painted an even more disturbing picture of a predator who had been operating undetected for nearly a decade, using his legitimate work as a wilderness guide to access and target vulnerable victims in some of America's most remote and beautiful locations. During the sentencing hearings, prosecutors presented evidence linking Brennan to at least 5 additional disappearances of young women in wilderness areas across California, Oregon, and Washington. While they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Brennan was responsible for all of these cases, the similarities were striking and suggested a pattern of predatory behavior that extended far beyond the murders of Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks. In each case, the victims were young women in their 20s who had been hiking or camping alone in remote areas where Brennan had been working or was known to frequent. The most compelling of these additional cases involved 23-year-old nature writer Sarah Chin, who had disappeared in Olympic National Park in June 2016. Like Jessica and Kelly, Sarah had been working on a professional project that required her to spend time alone in wilderness areas. She had last been seen talking to an unidentified man who matched Brennan's description near the Hoh River Trail. Her backpack had been found several months later, damaged and partially buried in a remote area of the park. Most significantly, a piece of her clothing had been found hanging from a tree branch in the same deliberate manner that had become Brennan's signature. Investigators had also connected Brennan to the 2015 disappearance of 25-year-old photographer Amanda Rodriguez in Sequoia National Park. Amanda had been documenting old-growth trees for an environmental organization when she vanished during what was supposed to be a 3-day solo camping trip. Her camera equipment had been found destroyed and hidden, and witnesses had reported seeing her talking to a bearded man in outdoor clothing shortly before she disappeared. The similarities to Brennan's known crimes were too numerous to be coincidental, and investigators believed that Amanda had been one of his earliest victims. The revelation of these additional cases had a profound impact on the sentencing proceedings. Federal prosecutors argued that Brennan's crimes represented one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in the history of America's national parks, and that his systematic targeting of young women in wilderness areas had created a climate of fear that threatened the safety and enjoyment of millions of park visitors. They requested the death penalty, arguing that Brennan's crimes were so heinous and his threat to public safety so severe that life imprisonment was insufficient punishment. The defense team, led by attorney Michael Davidson, continued to argue for life imprisonment without parole, claiming that Brennan's mental illness and troubled childhood had contributed to his criminal behavior. They presented testimony from psychiatrists who described Brennan as suffering from severe personality disorders that had impaired his ability to form normal relationships and had led to his obsession with controlling and dominating women. The defense argued that while Brennan's crimes were terrible, executing him would not bring back his victims or prevent similar crimes by other predators. During the sentencing hearings, the court heard extensive victim impact statements from the families of all the women who had been linked to Brennan's crimes. These statements provided a powerful reminder of the human cost of his predatory behavior and the lasting impact his actions had on the families and communities of his victims. Jessica Palmer's father, Robert, spoke about how his daughter's murder had destroyed his family's ability to find peace in the natural world that Jessica had loved so much. He described how they could no longer visit the places where Jessica had found joy and inspiration without being reminded of her violent death. Kelly Brooks' mother, Patricia, testified about the ongoing trauma of not knowing exactly what had happened to her daughter during her final moments. She spoke about the nightmares and anxiety that had plagued her family since Kelly's disappearance, and how the discovery of Brennan's journal had forced them to confront the horrific details of their daughter's murder. She told the court that while she was grateful that Brennan had been caught and convicted, no punishment could adequately address the magnitude of what he had taken from their family. The families of the other suspected victims also provided statements, even though Brennan had not been formally charged in their cases. Sarah Chen's parents spoke about the ongoing uncertainty of not knowing definitively what had happened to their daughter, and how Brennan's conviction had provided some measure of closure while also raising new questions about Sarah's fate. Amanda Rodriguez's sister testified about the impact of her disappearance on their close-knit family, and how the revelation of Brennan's crimes had renewed their hope that Amanda's case might finally be solved. The sentencing hearings also included testimony from law enforcement officials and park rangers about the broader impact of Brennan's crimes on wilderness safety and public confidence in the national park system. Chief Ranger David Thompson testified about the changes that had been implemented in Yosemite and other parks in response to Brennan's crimes, including increased patrols of remote areas, improved communication systems for solo hikers, and enhanced background checks for individuals working as wilderness guides. He emphasized that while these measures would help prevent similar crimes in the future, they could not undo the damage that Brennan had already caused. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a criminologist who had studied serial killers who operated in wilderness areas, testified about the unique challenges posed by predators like Brennan. She explained that the vast size and remote nature of national parks made it extremely difficult to detect and prevent crimes like those Brennan had committed. She noted that Brennan's use of his legitimate work as a wilderness guide had provided him with the perfect cover for his predatory activities, allowing him to approach potential victims without arousing suspicion and to access remote areas where crimes could be committed without detection. The prosecution also presented evidence about Brennan's lack of remorse and his continued threat to public safety. Prison officials testified that Brennan had shown no signs of accepting responsibility for his crimes and had continued to express fantasies about violence against women during his time in custody awaiting sentencing. Mental health professionals who had evaluated Brennan reported that he remained fixated on his crimes and showed no genuine empathy for his victims or their families. This evidence supported the prosecution's argument that Brennan would continue to pose a threat to others even if he were sentenced to life imprisonment. One of the most disturbing aspects of the sentencing proceedings was the revelation of additional evidence found in Brennan's possession that had not been presented during the trial. Investigators had discovered a collection of newspaper clippings and online articles about missing persons cases involving young women in wilderness areas across the western United States. Many of these cases dated back more than a decade, suggesting that Brennan had been following and possibly learning from similar crimes for years before he began killing. The collection included detailed notes and maps that indicated Brennan had been planning his crimes for much longer than investigators had initially realized. The court also heard testimony about Brennan's behavior during his years working as a wilderness guide, which provided additional insight into his predatory mindset. Former colleagues testified about his inappropriate comments about female clients and his tendency to volunteer for assignments that would put him in contact with young women hiking alone. Several former clients came forward to describe uncomfortable encounters with Brennan that they had not reported at the time, including instances where he had tried to separate them from their hiking companions or had made unwanted advances during what were supposed to be professional guide services. As the sentencing hearings drew to a close, both sides presented their final arguments about what punishment would be appropriate for Brennan's crimes. The prosecution emphasized the calculated nature of his crimes, the suffering he had caused to multiple families, and the ongoing threat he posed to public safety. They argued that the death penalty was the only punishment that adequately reflected the severity of his crimes and would ensure that he could never harm another innocent person. The defense made a final plea for life imprisonment, arguing that while Brennan's crimes were terrible, executing him would not serve the interests of justice or provide meaningful closure to the families of his victims. They emphasized that life imprisonment without parole would ensure that Brennan could never harm anyone again while avoiding the moral and practical complications associated with capital punishment. Judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over the trial and sentencing proceedings, took several days to consider all the evidence and arguments before announcing her decision. In her final statement before sentencing, she acknowledged the devastating impact of Brennan's crimes on his victims' families and the broader community of outdoor enthusiasts who had been affected by his predatory behavior. She noted that the evidence presented during the trial and sentencing hearings had revealed a level of calculated cruelty and systematic predation that was among the most disturbing she had encountered in her 25 years on the federal bench. If you've been following this case and want to see justice served, please share this video to help spread awareness about the dangers that can exist even in our most beautiful natural spaces. Your engagement helps us continue covering important cases like this one. Judge Williams ultimately sentenced Thomas Brennan to death by lethal injection, citing the heinous nature of his crimes, the suffering he had caused to multiple families, and the ongoing threat he posed to public safety. She noted that Brennan's systematic targeting of young women in wilderness areas represented a particularly egregious form of predatory behavior that had violated the trust and safety that millions of Americans expected when visiting national parks. The sentence was met with approval from the families of Brennan's victims, who felt that justice had finally been served for their daughter's murders. The aftermath of Thomas Brennan's death sentence reverberated throughout the outdoor recreation community and law enforcement agencies across the United States. Within weeks of the sentencing, the National Park Service announced a comprehensive review of safety protocols and background check procedures for all individuals working in wilderness areas. The case had exposed significant gaps in the system that had allowed a predator to operate undetected for years while using his legitimate employment as cover for his crimes. Park officials acknowledged that changes were necessary to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future and to restore public confidence in the safety of America's national parks. The families of Brennan's victims found themselves dealing with complex emotions following his sentencing. While they were grateful that justice had been served, the death penalty verdict brought little comfort to parents who would never see their daughters again. Linda Palmer, Jessica's mother, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse about the bittersweet nature of the verdict. She explained that while she was satisfied that Brennan would never be able to harm another family, no punishment could truly address the magnitude of what had been taken from them. The Palmers had lost not only their daughter but also their ability to find peace in the natural world that had been such an important part of Jessica's life and their family's shared experiences. The investigation into Brennan's crimes continued even after his sentencing, as law enforcement agencies worked to identify and solve additional cases that might be connected to his predatory activities. The FBI established a task force specifically dedicated to reviewing unsolved disappearances of young women in wilderness areas across the western United States, using the patterns identified in Brennan's known crimes to guide their investigation. This effort led to the reopening of dozens of cold cases and provided new hope to families who had been waiting years for answers about their missing loved ones. One of the most significant developments in the ongoing investigation was the discovery of additional evidence at a remote cabin that Brennan had rented under a false name in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. Acting on information found in his journal, investigators located the cabin and discovered a second collection of trophies and photographs that linked Brennan to at least 3 more murders. The evidence included personal items belonging to Sarah Chin, Amanda Rodriguez, and a third victim who had not previously been connected to Brennan's crimes. This discovery confirmed what investigators had long suspected, that Jessica Palmer and Kelly Brooks were part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior that had claimed multiple lives over nearly a decade. The revelation of additional victims prompted a new wave of grief and anger from the families affected by Brennan's crimes. Sarah Chen's parents, who had spent 3 years wondering what had happened to their daughter, finally received confirmation that she had been murdered by the same predator who had killed Jessica Palmer. While the knowledge brought a form of closure, it also forced them to confront the horrific details of their daughter's final moments and the systematic nature of the crimes that had taken her life. The Chin family filed a civil lawsuit against the tour company that had employed Brennan, arguing that inadequate background checks and supervision had enabled his predatory behavior. The impact of Brennan's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. The outdoor recreation industry faced intense scrutiny over safety protocols and the screening of employees who worked with solo hikers and campers. Several major tour companies implemented new policies requiring guides to work in pairs when leading trips into remote areas, and many began conducting more thorough background checks that included psychological evaluations and interviews with former clients. The changes were costly and time-consuming, but industry leaders acknowledged that they were necessary to prevent similar tragedies and to maintain public trust in outdoor recreation services. The case also prompted significant changes in how law enforcement agencies investigate missing persons cases in wilderness areas. The success of the joint investigation between multiple agencies highlighted the importance of sharing information and coordinating efforts across jurisdictional boundaries. The FBI established new protocols for identifying patterns in wilderness disappearances and created a national database that would allow investigators to quickly identify similarities between cases in different states. These changes were designed to prevent future predators from exploiting the isolation and jurisdictional complexities of wilderness areas to avoid detection. Educational institutions and outdoor recreation organizations began incorporating safety awareness programs specifically designed to address the types of risks that Brennan's crimes had highlighted. These programs focused on teaching solo hikers, particularly young women, how to recognize potentially dangerous situations and how to respond when approached by strangers in remote areas. The programs emphasized the importance of trusting instincts, maintaining communication with others, and avoiding situations where they might become isolated with unfamiliar individuals, even those who appeared to be legitimate guides or fellow outdoor enthusiasts. The psychological impact of Brennan's crimes on the broader hiking and photography communities was profound and lasting. Many young women who had previously enjoyed solo hiking and camping trips found themselves unable to continue these activities without experiencing anxiety and fear. Photography groups and hiking clubs reported significant increases in requests for group activities, as individuals who had once been comfortable exploring alone sought the safety of numbers. The crimes had fundamentally altered the relationship between outdoor enthusiasts and the wilderness areas they loved, introducing an element of fear and suspicion that had not existed before. Mental health professionals who worked with trauma survivors noted that Brennan's crimes had created a unique form of psychological impact because they had violated the sense of safety and peace that many people associated with natural environments. The wilderness had traditionally been viewed as a refuge from the dangers and stresses of urban life, but Brennan's predatory behavior had demonstrated that evil could exist even in the most beautiful and seemingly pristine locations. This realization forced many outdoor enthusiasts to fundamentally reconsider their relationship with nature and their assumptions about safety in wilderness areas. The legal proceedings against Brennan continued for several years as his defense team pursued appeals of his death sentence through the federal court system. These appeals focused primarily on challenging the admissibility of evidence found during the search of his cabin and questioning the constitutionality of the death penalty in cases involving crimes committed on federal land. However, the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Brennan and the systematic nature of his crimes made it unlikely that his conviction would be overturned. The appeals process provided little comfort to the families of his victims, who were forced to relive the trauma of his crimes each time the case returned to court. During the appeals process, additional evidence continued to emerge that further confirmed the scope of Brennan's criminal activities. Investigators working with international law enforcement agencies discovered that Brennan had traveled to wilderness areas in Canada and Mexico, where several young women had disappeared under circumstances similar to his known crimes in the United States. While jurisdictional complexities made it difficult to formally charge Brennan with these international crimes, the evidence suggested that his predatory behavior had extended across national borders and had claimed even more victims than previously known. The case also prompted legislative action at both the state and federal levels. Several states passed laws requiring more stringent background checks and licensing requirements for wilderness guides and outdoor recreation professionals. Federal legislation was introduced to establish minimum safety standards for tour companies operating in national parks and to create a national registry of individuals who had been banned from working in outdoor recreation due to safety violations or inappropriate behavior. While these measures could not undo the damage that Brennan had caused, they represented important steps toward preventing similar crimes in the future. As the years passed, the families of Brennan's victims worked to honor their daughters' memories while advocating for improved safety measures in wilderness areas. The Palmer family established a scholarship fund in Jessica's name to support young photographers pursuing nature and wildlife photography, with the requirement that recipients complete safety training programs before receiving their awards. The Brooks family created a foundation dedicated to improving communication systems in remote areas, funding the installation of emergency beacons and satellite communication devices on popular hiking trails. The story of Thomas Brennan's crimes and their aftermath became a cautionary tale that was studied by law enforcement agencies, criminologists, and outdoor safety experts around the world. The case demonstrated how predators could exploit the trust and isolation inherent in wilderness recreation to target vulnerable victims, and how the vast size and remote nature of wilderness areas could enable criminals to operate undetected for extended periods. The lessons learned from the investigation and prosecution of Brennan's crimes contributed to improved safety protocols and investigative techniques that would help protect future generations of outdoor enthusiasts. In the end, the discovery of Jessica Palmer's red underwear hanging from a tree branch in Yosemite had been more than just the first clue in solving her murder. It had been the beginning of an investigation that exposed one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in the history of America's national parks and led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies and the outdoor recreation industry approach wilderness safety. While the pain and loss experienced by the families of Brennan's victims could never be fully healed, their daughters' deaths had not been in vain if they prevented other families from experiencing similar tragedies. The case served as a stark reminder that evil could exist even in the most beautiful and seemingly safe environments, and that vigilance and preparation were essential for anyone venturing into remote wilderness areas. The red fabric that had fluttered in the wind high above the mist trail had ultimately led to justice for Jessica Palmer and the other young women whose lives had been cut short by Thomas Brennan's predatory behavior. Their memory would live on not only in the hearts of their families and friends, but also in the safety measures and awareness programs that had been created to protect others who shared their love of the natural world. If this story has impacted you and you want to help prevent similar tragedies, please consider sharing this video to raise awareness about wilderness safety. Together, we can honor the memory of these victims by working to make our natural spaces safer for everyone who seeks to explore and appreciate their beauty.